Hi, everyone. I just want to start by saying that I'm very grateful for the opportunity to get to speak with all of you. And I hope that my personal grappling with the kind of odd issue I'm facing in my own work currently can maybe help us think through our larger expectations around ethics, visibility, credit, and labor in our discipline. I'm in the process of finishing a book on the digitization of medieval manuscripts. In it, I argue that as digital archives continue to proliferate, we need a rigorous codicology for digital manuscripts and books, distinct from their analog hard copy exemplars. At the heart of this expanded codicology, I suggest, rest the same questions that we have long asked of digitized books, analog exemplars. Who made this book? When? Where? For whom? Using what tools? To what end? The rules of book history and manuscript studies, I contend, do not end or even change very radically when a medieval book is copied into digital form. But answering questions about when and why a digital book was made and who made it for what purpose requires developing a curious kind of double vision, simultaneously seeing the stages of medieval creation and digital recreation, seeing parchment and paper makers, patrons, scribes, rubricators, and illuminators, while also seeing modern digital project managers, funders, imaging, and metadata specialists. I want to make modern labor visible, to demystify for student and scholarly end users the workflows that go into the making of digital medieval books, and in doing so, to highlight and celebrate the workers and expertise that make and maintain the digital manuscripts upon which we increasingly depend. Given these commitments and stakes, imagine my utter mortification when one of my anonymous readers wisely noted that my image captions, while traditional for manuscript studies, were not enacting any of my arguments about rendering visible or celebrating modern imaging work and workers. In subsequent revisions, I have leapt at the opportunity to revise my captions to give credit more clearly where it is due. In essence, pushing my book's paratext to extend that double vision of looking at digital medieval books to a matching double citation practice, citing the hard copy manuscripts makers, if we know them, and when and where it was made, and also citing the digital manuscripts creators, if we know them, and when and where it was made. Implementing this, however, has been harder, weirder, and more interesting than I expected. Some of the imaging departments I've worked with have been very glad to share the name of the person who performed image capture. Some digitization specialists have even privately remarked to me that they have always wanted to have their names attached to the fruits of their labors, and it has bothered them when they are not visible. Others have balked at my desire to name a particular imaging specialist, suggesting that naming one person risks creating an incorrect impression of digitization by elevating one role at the cost of eliding all of the other steps that go into digital manuscript creation. Still others have told me regretfully that some of the information I am seeking about who performed what task has not been preserved. They'd like to be able to give me the names of the digitizers, but that data can't be found. And some have asked why on earth I would want such information. What good, I have been asked, could it possibly do for digitization specialists and other project contributors to be pushed into visibility by way of my citations? This variation between imaging studios and their best citational practices has forced me to rethink much of what I took for granted. More, it has forced me to rethink why I had assumed that naming and visibility are values that all makers and end users of digital manuscripts might share across our varied approaches and disciplines. I've uncovered 3 reasons that may go some way to explaining my obsession with names and credit. First, I tend to assume that it's good to name names because I have been brainwashed by 15th century English poets. Prolonged overexposure to John Lydgate may be particularly to blame. A little explanation is possibly warranted here. I came to digital manuscripts by way of a Mellon-supported Council on Libraries and Information Resources postdoc in data curation for medieval studies. But before that, I did my PhD in English literature, with a particular focus in 15th century Middle English verse. While this may not be true of all or even most medieval writers, the 15th century English writers I studied treated publicly recording their literary debts as a profound ethical demand. Writers immediately after Chaucer, especially John Lydgate, repeatedly praise and pray for the elder poet in their own writing, so that Chaucer's name echoes through more than a century of poetry following his death. While some modern scholars have interpreted this persistent effort as evidence of anxious competition with the dead elder poet, I came to see habitual naming and intertwined praying as a self-conscious tool of care. Through this multi-decade, multi-generational chorus of here is what Chaucer and his work have given me, so here is what I owe him in return, these writers constructed a self-conscious bookish community across the life after life divide. As I read and reread these longer poems, I came to see how it was not just Chaucer's name that mattered. The writer, narrator, kind of main character of The Fall of Princes repeatedly mentions that he is writing this monumental poem to get a name. And throughout The Fall of Princes, hundreds of characters push that same main character narrator to listen and then tell their stories so that their names will be remembered too. After steeping myself in this for years, I had been thoroughly convinced by my medieval sources well before I ever began work on a digital medieval book. The second reason that I have tended to assume that it's good to name names has to do with what I have perceived as major disciplinary trends and values in manuscript studies. I was in graduate school when Lynn Mooney's argument about Adam Pinkhurst and Chaucer's poem Adam Scrivain came out. I remember delighting in the shockwaves when it hit, and I have happily followed all of the subsequent waves of argument that have emerged in response. Can we really say that Adam Pinkhurst wrote this? Is the identification of Thomas Hoccleve as this particular scribe correct? Beneath the arguments about who really wrote what in which book, it seems to me that that corner of the field agrees, almost unanimously, that there is real value in working to expand the group of named historical persons who we know labored in the copying of medieval books. Part of rigor, and also part of the act of loving medieval books, seems to be wanting to know everything about how they were made, including, where we can, who made them. A third reason that I have been brainwashed into thinking names matter likely comes from the frantic nature of the academic job market in which I have been swimming for about a decade now. When 300 or more people apply for every job, getting your name on positively everything you have done can feel like the magical charm that may help you snatch that rare gold ring of full-time employment. Likewise, having your name left off of something can feel like a professional death sentence. As I was doing my postdoctoral work between 2013 and 2015, and in the years since, these ideas have braided together in my brain, so that naming came to feel like being a good rigorous scholar, being a good ethical person, and a basic pragmatic act of self-preservation. But the blank looks, chuckles, and firm responses that I have collected from the digital imaging specialists who have answered my caption queries have pointed me to look much more broadly. And perhaps unsurprisingly, outside of late medieval English poetry and manuscript studies, there is a vast transdisciplinary body of work exploring how naming is not necessarily at all a public good. In Control Z, The Right to be Forgotten, legal scholar and technologist Meg Lita Jones explores what she calls the principle of informational self-determination. That is, the right to decide for oneself how one will be portrayed to third parties or the public, as well as what or to what extent personal information is made available and to whom. Jones's explorations of the dark side of modern digital memory struck a chord for me with the pointed questions some institutions raised when I asked to cite digital imaging specialists by name. My nerdy yearnings to know and praise, however well-intentioned, do not weigh more than any individual contributor's right to determine whether or not they want that information communicated. Archivist-authored scholarship has likewise laid out for me the stark tensions between serving scholarly end users' voracious hunger to know all the things and fulfilling the requests of donors, protecting their rights to privacy, and to not necessarily have all of their dirty laundry preserved in public for perpetuity. Although digital imaging specialists are contributors and not at all the same as donors, these arguments too strike a chord. Book historians are total geeks, reveling in the technical minutiae of bookmaking and reading the traces and manuscripts with attention and care. But I think that we are also gossips, keen for the details that make long dead bookmakers seem dazzlingly human and alive once more. I delighted, for instance, when I connected the fact that the first printed edition of Huntington Library HM111, an autographed manuscript made by the 15th century poet Thomas Hoccleve, was printed in the print shop of Charles Roworth, likely using the Roworth Press, a once celebrated, now largely lost, late 18th and early 19th century experiment at speeding print production. But I also delighted equally when I found a snarky, breathless note in an early 19th century gentleman's magazine whispering that George Mason, the editor of that same first printed edition of HM111, had had an illegitimate daughter, never acknowledged in life, that was only discovered when his will was read aloud. Book historians perhaps are, and are not, the kind of people that you might want to entrust with perpetuating and protecting your name. A touchstone piece of writing for my thinking about digitization is the wonderful blog post by Kristen A. Phelps, Photographed by the Hand of a Sinner, in which she compares the anonymity of modern digital imaging specialists to the deliberate and humble anonymity practiced by medieval Byzantine icon painters. Many pre-14th century Byzantine artists, Phelps explains, shunned the hubristic act of signing the icons they created, writing instead, painted by the hand of a sinner, in order to allow the sacred value of the icon to remain unfettered by human presence. Phelps continues, fast forward to the modern world and a secular context, millions of digital images are accessed every day on websites of museums, libraries, archives, and other collections. These images are taken by unseen photographers and are unsigned. The anonymity of the process allows for pure and non-distracted understanding of the object by the viewer. But these evocative and compelling and entirely persuasive lines are actually only the start of her blog post. And Phelps goes on to ask and then answer some of the same questions that have long fascinated me. But who are these modern day artists who make invaluable works of art, faith, and history accessible to us all? How does their particular art form impact what we are able to view on our computer screens, tablets, and smartphones? To answer these questions, we are going behind the scenes. For my part, I've given up, at least for now, on having one standard caption for all the digital manuscripts in my book. Instead, I write what different institutions and digital imaging specialists tell me is their own preferred best practice. This variation, I tell myself, is a form of tribute and visibility. By doing what curators and digitizers tell me to do, I am honoring their labor. But wrestling with all of these issues, I have come to see that names have been a convenient shorthand for what I really want for our discipline. Ultimately, I want us to develop a shared disciplinary value that is nothing less than the total and complete destruction of innocent looking and naive use. I want end users of digital manuscripts to have to think every time, at least a little, about the object in front of them as unique from its analog exemplar. to make the effort with each digital manuscript collection to understand the parameters of the modern project that made it, to know its workflows, and to acknowledge all of the expertise and real human labor that go into making and maintaining our digital medieval manuscript revolution. This is the rigor that book historians and codicologists habitually demand of themselves and each other. Why should we, as digital codicologists, be satisfied with anything less? Thank you so much.